It's Thanksgiving time. Lots of you might be taking a break from political news. I don't blame you. In fact, I'm all for it. For this week, I have something different for you, something that should give you hope for the future and at the same time continue the mission of this show, exposing what the mainstream media fails to cover or cover accurately. There is a silly and really lame pattern in a lot of news organizations. Once in a while, they take an example of people who are thought of as being in opposite camps, in warring camps, and they show them getting along and engaging in some activity together, like their kids playing soccer together, or they're in a choir together, or doing some art project, or whatever. Just about every time, the news agency acts like it's this big deal that should give you hope for humanity. In reality, that kind of thing happens all the time. There are relatively few places in which people are actually fully separated from each other. But note what I said there. There are few places. There are some, because that's what happens when a group of people are kicked out of a huge swath of the world in what's called ethnic cleansing. The people left in that huge swath of the world don't know anyone who was part of that community that was kicked out. Now, there is a group doing something about this. Today, you'll hear from the head of a group that's bringing people from Arab nations to Israel, and they're traveling to other countries to show the world that this is happening. I touched on this in a previous episode, and I promised then that I'd bring you the story of it. So now I am. Plus, you will hear from an Egyptian man who is so brave in the way that he speaks out about what he sees going on in the Middle East and specifically with the media. His analysis is better than just about anything you'll see or hear or read in mainstream news. It's so insightful. So I'm sure it will not surprise you that major news agencies have been ignoring him, because he does not represent their preferred narrative. That plus a Thanksgiving message for you and some others coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. If you are in the United States, happy Thanksgiving or happy Thanksgiving time. I guess that applies also if you're an expat, an American living somewhere else in the world. By the way, once I took a trip to Canada in October and people were wishing me a happy Thanksgiving and I got confused at first, but Google to the rescue. Then I was like, thanks. You might be listening to this while you are preparing for Thanksgiving. If so, good luck with that, or traveling, or maybe the holiday's over and your tryptophan coma has worn off and now you're attempting Black Friday shopping. Wherever you are, thank you so much for listening. I am Josh Levs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, that fact-checks the news. I started this show in mid-spring earlier this year. I'm grateful to you all for the fact that it has gotten this far. And with your support, hopefully, it will continue. I really appreciate everyone who's doing everything you can to support this show, whether that means you're becoming a paid subscriber to the newsletter or making a contribution or getting corporations and organizations to support the show. Lots of options for you. You can learn about them in the show notes and at the newsletter, which is free and packed with links and information for you and action steps and images and videos and a lot more. I've been getting so many responses from you to the recent coverage of elections that I did about how messed up the exit polls are and the conflicting reports from all these news organizations about why people voted the way they did. I'm preparing another episode that will focus on your questions. So stay tuned for that. For this week, something different. I had the chance to interview some people from a group called Sharaka. This was created to help build positive relationships between people in Arab nations and Israel. And there is a context for this that's important to understand. I've mentioned before that in the 1930s and 40s, there were these vicious pogroms across the Arab and Muslim world, many of them inspired by Nazis. Jewish people had to flee for their lives, losing everything. They became by far the biggest population in Israel. And that's part of what's so amazing about the story of Israel, that they then chose democracy when founding Israel, even though the nations that they came from were not democratic and they were always second, third, fourth class citizens there. Anyway, way more Jewish people lost everything in those expulsions than Arab people living under the British Empire who fled. And yet the world is supposed to completely stop for the descendants of those Arab people who are now classified by the world as Palestinian, while ignoring what happened with everyone else in the 20th century. Anyway, for today's purposes, understand this. While people in Israel have friends and work together with and live together with and have relationships with, and in some cases are married to and have babies with people of different backgrounds, including Arab people, including Muslim people, that is generally not possible in the Arab and Muslim world because basically no Jews are left. After what's called the Abraham Accords, in which these nations that were not actually warring, but these nations developed new diplomatic agreements. In the wake of that, Sharaka has been working to try to turn it into something that makes a concrete difference on a person-to-person basis rather than just at the governmental or business levels. So you're first going to hear my interview with the executive director of Sharaka, Dan Pfefferman.
The founders of the organization sensed a historic opportunity here to help turn these diplomatic agreements into a reality through people-to-people engagement. And so Sharaka means partnership in Arabic. We style ourselves a peace startup, the hub, where anyone who wants to engage in people-to-people activity can work through us. We work with a lot of different groups and organizations to facilitate these engagements. And the idea being that if and when we can form networks of human and personal relationships and contacts, cultural understanding, then the peace becomes very real, warm, and robust and can weather different kinds of political turmoils.
So you organize visits together to different countries across the Middle East and here in the United States and elsewhere?
Yeah, the main office is based in Israel, but we have an office in the Gulf. Right now, it's been in Bahrain for the last couple of years, and we have a senior staff member there. We have an expanding office right now, an expanding presence in Morocco. We have staff and volunteers and partners around the world, including Jews and Muslims who live in the West and in countries that aren't a part of the Abraham Accords. And we work on connecting with the people who we would deem influential, whether they have decent social media followings, whether they're journalists, intellectuals, professors, religious leaders, or community leaders. We try to engage with them, get them to come on these educational trips to Israel. We work on bringing Israelis to these different parts of the Arab world to form connections and understanding. We have educational programs, including our biggest one that works on Holocaust education as a way to prevent extremism and future genocides in the Arab and Muslim world. And we do a lot of activism, sending joint delegations of Arabs from around the region and Israelis around the United States to try to tackle the misinformation, the polarization, the extremism, and the ignorance.
What do you do to try to build awareness and education through media in all these different places?
There really is a lot of ignorance, a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding about anything connected to Israel and its various areas of conflict, whether Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc. So much so that when our delegations come to Israel, there is such a shock between the reality of Israel, as imperfect as it might be, and what they think that they're going to encounter from the news and from social media. And the reason we engage with a lot of people who have decent media and social media platforms is so they can convey this reality to their followers. And what we're looking for here is authenticity. We also work as much as we can with certainly local media in Israel and a little bit of international media in Israel and in the United States where we can. In the Arab world, also Morocco and in the Gulf. I have to say, though, we have not succeeded at all in getting through to the mainstream Western media, who seems completely uninterested in the fact that there are a lot of Jews and a lot of Arabs who are starting to get along and trying to figure out how to put aside their differences.
Absolutely. Are you able to get any of this reported, shared, discussed in the media in these Arab nations?
So a lot of our recent stuff has been covered positively and negatively in the Moroccan media. We had a delegation of 23 mostly university-age student leaders come to Israel in July. Got a lot of attention, some good and some bad. Our work in Bahrain, this was prior to October 7th, did get a little bit of media attention. And some of our efforts, such as when we've taken delegations to Poland, to Auschwitz, to learn about the Holocaust, we managed to get a feature piece in a very respected Saudi foreign affairs magazine about that. There are Western publications, they're Arabic or Urdu or other platforms that have very positively covered what we do. So our work has been on Voice of America or Al Hura, which is its Arab World extension. We've managed to connect with a decent number of BBC journalists, especially in Pashto and Urdu. And so they've covered what we do. Deutsche Welle's Arabic ran a big piece about one of our delegations. So here and there, we've managed to, in those languages to those audiences, we've had a serious number of senior Afghani and Pakistani journalists come to Israel and provide objective coverage about what's happening in Israel. Those are firsts, and we hope to be able to do more.
You mentioned that there was some negative coverage. It doesn't surprise me, but a group of people wanting to come along and build connections and mutual understanding. What were the negative spins in the media in the region?
We had this group of young Moroccans come. We don't really do anything political or that we would call political in our programs, but we do meet officials. We do learn about the war in Gaza, obviously from an Israeli perspective, but as objectively as possible. And the spin in these negative media was these Zionist Moroccans are coming to Israel to celebrate the genocide of the Palestinians or something along that line.
Got it. Let's talk about mainstream media here in the United States and other Western countries. What I've been reporting on my podcast, there are actual rules, standards, and practices inside news agencies that are designed to always portray Israel in the worst possible light. What have you run into? Do they ignore you? Do they say no and give you reasons? What happens?
It just seems to get ignored, seems to get buried. It's funny. The one time we actually managed to get some Washington Post and NPR coverage was when one of our Pakistani journalist participants, the first one, it caused an uproar in Pakistan that he visited Israel and he was fired from his very senior media position. That was the story. The fact that a Pakistani delegation came to Israel, the fact that a very senior Pakistani came to try to learn about Israel, try to promote peace, that's not the story.
What is your message to the mainstream media here in the United States and in other Western nations?
It's failing in its job of objectively reporting, giving it the proper context and analysis, and having lost moral clarity on issues of right and wrong. The fact that they will quote without question a Hamas statistic that can't possibly be true, but then give a healthy dose of skepticism to official Israeli statistics really irks me. And simply because Israel is, again, with all its flaws, is a democracy with a free press, with a military spokesperson. And I served a long time in the military. I know that they really do work to convey the truth, which is why it takes them many hours to put out a message, where Hamas or Hezbollah or other organizations can just say whatever they want within minutes. And the fact that the world, the media, the UN jumps on the Hamas quotes and questions the Israeli versions of event shows you where the moral bearing of the people in these organizations, the people editing or writing the news, the people at the UN lie. People really need to wake up to this. We cannot be giving the same amount of respect and credibility to a terrorist organization as we can to a democratic country.
But we do. Everything about it is just the opposite of journalism. Facts first, always.
Believe it or not, there is a connection between Thanksgiving and Jewish history. You might think, wait, what? Come on, that's a bridge too far. How is he going to connect those two things? Aha, it's the opposite. I'm only bringing this up because there is a connection. I touched on this in my recent speech on the October 7th anniversary. You can hear or see that speech in full. It was episode 27. I did the keynote at a commemoration event. In it, I talked about something that's not widely known. What some of the explorers who came here from Europe centuries ago said that they saw. I explained that there are these old writings in which some of these people spoke out about their horrors about the mistreatment of native people who were living here and how they hoped that fellow Europeans who were mistreating them would get into trouble back home in Europe. Little did they know how that would end up going. But anyway, among them, some did this.
And some of them swore when they got back to Europe that they had met people here among the Indians who were saying the Shema, common Jewish prayer, and referring to God as Yahweh, And then there was temporarily this theory about a lost tribe that was pretty much debunked. But the possibility is still very much there that some of us were here long ago. This is what happens when your peoplehood has existed for thousands of years and you have to flee everywhere. You end up with a few of you everywhere.
I'm grateful to every group that books me for events, and I would love to do more speaking events and fireside chats and that kind of thing in the year ahead. For information on that, you can find a link in the show notes and at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. I am grateful for people like this next guy you're going to hear from. His name is Hassan Hassaneem. He's Egyptian. He's a policy analyst and advisory board member of Sharaka. I found his insights so much deeper, more interesting, and more sensible than so much of what we hear and read and see in mainstream media. So it will not shock you that he has not been picked up by big news agencies because he does not represent their preferred narrative. As we listen to Hassan, I am going to jump in a few times to help you understand what he's talking about and give you some extra context. As you're listening, think about whether you have heard from anyone in mainstream news who comes from an Arab nation, who is an analyst, who is offering as much insight as Hassan.
Peace existed for decades between government to government, the business communities, which was very also limited number of people, but it never trickled down to the civil societies. People-to-people interactions barely existed. The essence of any kind of peace treaties is that people get to know each other's, so this way we ensure that conflicts don't get out of control in the region at some point and erupt. And all of a sudden, the Abraham Accord happens. For the first time, you witnessed governments in the Middle East allowing their people open up to Israel as a society. They can openly work with their Israeli counterparts, travel to each other's countries, and even talk openly about the work they do. And even though there is some backlash in Arab countries, the government did not allow the majority or the strong critical ones to harm the individual who tries to think creatively or do something that is uncommon. And this is in itself, by the way, an accomplishment. And it's a reflection of how things are changing in some parts in the Middle East, which I call it the moderate axis in the region.
You call it the moderate axis?
Because the Middle East is divided nowadays between the Iranian axis, I would call it the evil axis, and the moderate axis. You have the Iranian axis is represented by terror groups, which are Iranian proxies in Gaza, such as Hamas, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and others in Syria and Iraq, and the moderate ones that came to the conclusion, especially in the Gulf countries, in the past 10 years, that they don't want a similar model as the Iranian axis, and also they don't want a version of the Sunni political Islam Muslim Brotherhood ruling style taking over their countries, because the result will be exactly what happened in Gaza as Hamas did.
All right, I'm jumping in here for a sec. You heard Hassan say that in his view, there is a moderate axis and an evil axis. That term, evil axis, might sound familiar to you because of something President George W. Bush said in 2002, the year after the September 11th attacks. Bush was talking about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Hassan is saying just in the Middle East itself, he sees two axes. One that he calls the evil axis, which includes Iran and groups aligning with Iran. And he sees a moderate axis, nations that are trying to build toward peace, including those that are part of the Abraham Accords that I mentioned earlier. And he specifically mentioned that some Gulf countries apply in there. So Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. He was explaining that they don't want to be overtaken by a group like Hamas. This is where things might get a little bit trickier, but follow me here. Hamas is an offshoot of something called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is based in Egypt. We don't need to go into all these specifics here. I know it can sound confusing. Keep in mind that for most of history, the world was not divided into countries, individual nation states as we have now. There were empires. There was the huge Arab Islamic Empire. So it's not surprising that there would be different groups created in different parts of the Arab world. Anyway, big picture, Hassan sees two axes forming. I talked to him about something I've covered, that what we see with the fighting between Israel and these terrorist groups in Gaza and Lebanon, that is really part of a proxy war for the Middle East, with some of these nations in the region wanting Israel to win, wanting Israel to beat back the influence of Iran and these evil terrorist groups. Hassan says many people in the region also see the dangers of a group like Hamas taking over.
Hamas is a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood ideological organization. And after ruling Gaza by an iron fist for 17 years, the result is what we see nowadays, the destruction of the Gaza because the irresponsible behavior of this group.
This gets us right to the geopolitical nature of this fight. The media in this country, and from what I've seen, the media in Europe, presents it as Israel being alone and this aggressor. What they don't show is the extent to which this is a proxy war for the Middle East. Presenting as these two axes makes sense. Do you see any media understanding the kind of geopolitical interplays across the region that you're describing?
For the West, I feel like the picture is missing a lot. In the Middle East perspective, the media is divided between two camps. The camp that is trying to instigate and glorify actions of terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and the new emerging media, which existed for decades, but they changed the rhetoric, especially after October 7th, which makes Israel is not alone in the region. And this is, you could find it in Al Arabiya channels, Sky News Arabia, which are channels based in Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. And the reason that these kind of media are sympathized with what Israel is doing, the governments over there came to the conclusion that groups like Hamas create devastation and destruction in the region, and they would like to use what they have done or what they caused Gaza to go through nowadays as an example for their own publics. You could see also in the case of Lebanon as well, a society that is going through lots of socio-economic problems. The state is almost a failed state, and Hezbollah dragging the society and the whole country into unnecessary conflict with Israel in the name of supporting a fellow like-minded group like Hamas.
Jumping back in quickly again here, I spoke with Hassan about Jordan and Egypt specifically. These are two countries that border Israel and that have long wanted Israel to stave off Hamas and Hezbollah. They want Israel to do the hard work here without saying publicly that that's what they're doing. Jordan shot down missiles in this war, but has also made all kinds of anti-Israel statements. I asked Hassan what he sees in the media in these two countries, including Egypt, where he's from.
Yeah, you mentioned a good point when you said Israel is doing the hard work. Moderate Arab countries in the Middle East would like to use Israel as a proxy when it comes to fighting terror groups in the region, because they have invested so much time in trying to eradicate these groups, and it seems it has not been working. So who could roll its sleeves and just go on the ground and do the hard work? I think Egypt and Jordan, based on my own humble observation, they have been a little bit disappointing media-wise since October 7th. As I said, there is the moderate camp and the evil camp. I think Jordan and Egypt, I would put them in the middle, From one hand, they have a strong interest that Hamas gets eradicated by Israel, and they understand the Muslim Brotherhood ideology tries to replace them. But from the other hand, the media rhetoric in both countries since October 7th has been very escalatory, a little bit aggressive, and very, very biased.
None of what you're saying shows up in normal mainstream news coverage here in the United States or in the West, right? Have you seen it at all?
Not much, to be honest, yeah.
Well, listen, I always say on my show that truth equals facts plus context. And I can tell you now, all three of you have brought more facts and context to this conversation than any of the talking head conversations you see or hear or read in mainstream media all the time. So the media should be all over the three of you and others from this group describing what's happening to provide people real insight. But that would require the media accepting that their preferred narrative has been wrong all along. Thank you so much.
And that's why we're lucky to have an interview with a guy like you trying to spread our message in the West.
The third person I referred to there is Fatema Alharbi. I spoke with her in episode 30 toward the end of that episode. I'll link to it in the show notes and the newsletter so you can find it quickly. She is awesome too, and an athlete and so brave. See, things to be thankful for, no matter where you stand in U.S. politics. I'll be right back. Hey, did you know that there's such a thing as Happy Thanksgiving music that does not involve the words gobble gobble? Check this out. You know I love happy music. This is really cool. At just about all times, there are some paid campaigns underway. I've been asked to participate, and here's how it works. I get a unique link that's just mine. If you click on that link to check out a video or listen to a new podcast or sign a petition or pledge some kind of future action, if you do that, then the group makes a contribution to this show. It's a free way that you can help subsidize the costs of this show. As you probably know, getting through in the attention economy takes work and expense. Whatever you can do to help means so much. I'm sure I've overused these two words throughout this episode, but I'm going to say it now anyway. Thank you. Before we go, a quick note about Thanksgiving. By now, it is widely known that the myth of Thanksgiving is very much not the reality. The real history involves all kinds of warring and horrible mistreatment of indigenous people, of course. An author named David Silverman wrote a book called This Land is Their Land, which traces a bunch of the history. He gave a talk about it that I'll post for you in the newsletter so you can see it. Here is a little clip.
Throughout the colonial era, Thanksgiving had no association whatsoever with Pilgrims and Indians. None. The link between the holiday and the history appears to date to 1841, when the Reverend Alexander Young published a primary source account of a 1621 harvest feast hosted by Plymouth Colony and attended by neighboring Wampanoags. This is the entire primary source account of Thanksgiving. That's it. To it, Young added an influential footnote. And let me tell you, as a historian, there are not a lot of influential footnotes out there. It reads, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." Over the next 50 years, various authors, artists, lecturers, and politicians disseminated this idea until Americans took it for granted.
He mentioned groups that disseminated the myth, but there's one he left out there: the media. News agencies long referred to the myth as though it's real. I looked at an archive of newspapers from the 1800s and 1900s. You can see the myth treated as reality. These days, news agencies do pieces acknowledging the real history and the myth, but do they talk about the media's complicity in having spread that myth? This relates directly to what you've been hearing about in the rest of this episode, and a topic I've talked about often on this show. Today, the mainstream media is spreading myths about history and indigeneity, calling the people of Judea, the people of Israel, colonizers in Judea, colonizers in Israel. I'm not saying it's the same, but it took the media more than a century to start refuting myths that it helped perpetuate. How long will it take the media this time to acknowledge how wrong it has been? The good news, though, is that we live in an era in which we can spread truths about all kinds of things the media messes up. Not just that, but U.S. politics, health issues, modern fatherhood, tons of topics that I've addressed in reality checks here on this show. I would be so grateful if you take a couple of minutes to share this show, any episodes that you especially like, and tell people about it. If you're doing Thanksgiving, maybe bring it up and encourage people to listen and subscribe and join this movement to put facts first. Also, rate and review it on the podcast platforms. That's how the algorithms know to recommend it to people. We make it easy for you by giving you a link in the show notes that will take you to a whole bunch of places where you can rate and review. As always, I would love to hear from you. There are 2 ways you can get in touch. Paid subscribers to the newsletter can message me there. Everyone else can find a form at my website, joshlevs.com. Thank you so much for listening. It means a great deal. I will see you next week.